Thank you all to our speakers that are here today with us for another in the COVID series for terrorism. General Gray and I are here on behalf of Potomac Institute to welcome all of you as speakers and attendees today. Yonah brought in the best to talk about how the military has responded and been able to help mitigate some of the effects of the pandemic here in the United States and abroad. I know personally from the Institute, we were asked to help the Air Force in their response for the Defense Production Act and how they were going to prioritize their requests out to industry. And so the Institute hit the ground running last March to really help the US military in their response. But I want to open up the discussion and have our distinguished speakers talk about their reflections and their perspective of the military's response to the pandemic. So military, was integral in the way that the US responded. And so hearing all of you today talk to that for lessons learned and how we might look to the future of what we could do, it would be fantastic. So thank you all, and Yonah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jen, for your opening remarks. As you indicated, for the past year and a half or so during the corona crisis, we focused on health and security issues. And prior to that, of course, we tried to deal academically with interdisciplinary and international challenges related to terrorism, all the way from primitive to high tech. And again, trying to deal with responses, governmental, non-governmental, intergovernmental, and so on. So that's the background. I would like at this point just to introduce briefly our speakers, and then we're going to move on in the interest of time to the individual presenters to make a presentation and have a few questions related to the presentation. And once we complete the round, we're going to have an opportunity to develop a Q&A discussion. So again, thank you again, Jen. Thank you, General Gray, for providing the leadership for many, many years. And we're looking forward to your remarks. So first, the first speaker, and I will introduce you in a minute, Lieutenant General retired Vincent Stewart, as you know, the 20th Director of Defense Intelligence Agency, and we'll come back to him in a minute or so. Then Professor Rita Caldwell, who is a distinguished university professor at Maryland, Johns Hopkins, and a senior fellow at the Potomac, and we worked together on the bio threats for quite a number of years. And we want to welcome for the first time Major General retired Dr. Michael Ionescu from Romania, who is a professor at the National School of Political Administrative Studies in Bucharest. And we're delighted that there is the connection now that we can really speak. And then, of course, Ambassador Charles Ray, who worked with us for quite a number of years on the role of diplomacy in combating terrorism, and most recently on the bio threats. And as I mentioned, General Gray, the 29th Commandant of the US Marine Corps and the Chairman of the Board of Regents at the Potomac, will be able to participate whenever he would like to during the discussion, and of course to make some closing remarks. Now, again, I wanted to make sure that we're focusing on the purpose of this discussion. We are trying to deal not in general with traditional and passive active defense missions regarding the terrorism challenge of fighting wars. That's in general, obviously it will come up, and we spend many years to focus on that. But the current forum will discuss the role of the military amid the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, we're going to look at the past lessons, the past experiences, the future risks, and the best practices, response strategies at home and abroad. But now it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Lieutenant General Vincent Stewart. Is a major contribution to us on the role of the military that we published actually in 2016, I believe, at the time, and he participated as a keynote at the time, and we published his remarks, and you will be able to read them as well, and now his presentation. So again, I think that we're very fortunate to have an individual, a leader in US and international strategic concerns. And as many of you know, he retired from the US Marine Corps after more than 38 years of active service to the United States. And during his final tour of duty, he served as Deputy Commander of the United States Command, Cyber Command, and so on. And when we were introduced to him, he was the 20th Director of Defense Intelligence Agency. So again, he contributed a great deal during his service to the Marine Corps. In terms of the cyber, for example, issues and others and intelligence. And once he retired, he became a member of a variety of professional associations, public and private boards. And also he served on government committees and panels over the years. I'm very pleased to report that academically, he was educated all the way from Western Illinois University to Naval War College, as well as the National Defense University and Harvard. We are very grateful for his distinguished service, and we're looking forward to his presentation. General?
Professor Alexander, thank you for incredibly gracious introduction and the opportunity to talk a little bit about the role of the military in pandemic. I won't call myself an expert in this space, but I will offer some things. One, putting this conversation into context, and then talking about the planning factors that the department went through, and then maybe at the end, kind of give an assessment of how I thought they did. In the spring of 2018, the then Director of National Intelligence at the Worldwide Threat Hearings, a hearing I'm thankful that I no longer have to do, offered the following. We assess that the United States and the world will remain vulnerable to the next flu pandemic or large-scale outbreak of a contagious disease that could lead to massive rates of death and disability, severely affect the world economy, strain international resources, and increase calls on the United States for support. I don't know if anybody read that, but that was what was put out at the Worldwide Threat Hearing. On December 31st of 2019, China reports a pneumonia of an unknown cause in Wuhan province. They reported this to the World Health Organization. On January 1st, 2020, the Chinese officials closed the seafood market thought to be the source of the viral pneumonia cases. What we now know is that patient zero is believed to have happened as early as November 2019, according to the official statements from Chinese. And the first US coronavirus case is reported in Washington on 20 January 2020. What we also know is that this deadly virus, this deadly global pandemic designated COVID-19, has taken the lives of 628,504 Americans and 4,443,557 across the globe. This according to the Johns Hopkins COVID tracker. We also know that the pandemic has created both a public health crisis and an economic crisis in the United States, disrupting lives, pushing the hospital system to capacity, and creating a global economic slowdown. While it is still uncertain, what is still uncertain is whether the virus originated in the seafood market or was an inadvertent release from the biological lab in Wuhan. We now know much more in retrospect than we did at the time. How virulent is the virus? How is the virus spread? Should we test? Should we isolate? Should we vaccinate without knowing much about the virus? Can we develop a vaccine? How do we manage the crisis in the United States? Do we take a global approach or go it alone? What should our policy be? And that was a great debate in the early stages. On level, we understood that we were in a crisis, that we were in warlike conditions. And if we believe we're at war to defeat this virus, and we have the most capable military in the world, for many, the obvious question becomes, what role should the military play in fighting and defeating this virus? So we took apart the situation, as we do as planners. We knew that we needed to do at least the following things: understand the virus, translate, gather intelligence, develop a counter to the virus, develop treatments and/or vaccine, understand how we could better identify the spread of the virus, testing, support the development and treatment of vaccine, distribute the vaccine across states, municipalities, and tribal areas. All great intensive logistics effort that we are particularly good at. So let's look at the mission of the department relative to pandemics. And if you go to the Army Pub, it says the mission of DoD in a pandemic is to preserve US combat capabilities and readiness, but not just for the sake of combat readiness, but to support US government efforts to save lives, reduce human suffering, and slow the spread of the infection. Now, again, we've had at least that mission statement out there for 2 or 3 years, so that was clear. In the National Implementation Plan, they identify 11 separate, 13 different tasks and directs the department to pay particular attention to these tasks. Interestingly enough, number 1 is advancing international cooperation. Task further secure that international commitment to transparency, scientific application, rapid reporting, and sharing of data. That was the number 1 task in the National Implementation Plan. Build international capacity, ensure rapid response is number 3. The capability to rapidly respond either independently or in support of a more global response. Number 4, ensure early warning and situational awareness. Number 5, establish a border and transportation strategy. Number 6, establishing screening protocols and implementation agreements. Number 7, I found really interesting, ensure effective risk communication to increase national and international awareness of the risk of the virus and appropriate behaviors to reduce these risks. Ensure that timely, accurate, and credible information is provided by spokespeople at all levels of the government. if there is a breakdown that I could point to almost immediately, it is how ineffective we were as a nation in communicating risk. And maybe we'll come back and talk about that. Number 8, providing guidance on maximizing surge capacity with available resource. I will certainly talk about that. Comprehensive guidance on community shielding, clear guidance for the private sector and institutions, rapid diagnosis and support, establishing stockpiles and antivirals, and advanced technology and production capacity. So those are the 13 things that are identified that directed the Department of Defense to pay close attention to. Typically, you take that guidance and you build a series of essential tasks. And going back as early as 2006, the department identified 19 critical planning categories: intelligence, force protection, biosurveillance, interagency planning support, surge of medical care for U.S. forces, patient transport and strategic airlifts, installation support to civilian agency, bulk transportation, on and on, 19 categories that were essential to the department. As a result of that analysis, NORTHCOM, Northern Command, had the lead and their role as defense support to civilian authorities. And they designated a task force headed up by General Perma from the National Guards. What's interesting also about the planning guidance, it specifically talks about how to integrate the reserves in any support on the homeland. So we have a planning order that's issued by the Joint Staff. NORTHCOM has the lead as the supported agency. The National Guard under General Perma is the Joint Task Force Commander, and they go about executing the task I assigned. When you look back now at what the National Guard and the department did, they covered every task, whether it was communicating to mortuary affairs, to refueling aircraft, to border security, to international engagement. I don't think whatever we did to recognize General Perma, it is not enough. Every task was covered. So for instance, the National Center for Medical Intelligence, United States Army Medical Research and Development Command, the Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease, all went to work on finding answers to what the cause, taking apart the virus, and creating opportunities for us to build a vaccine. From building and staffing alternative medical facilities, augmenting existing medical facilities, mortuary affairs, medevacing infected personnel, providing border security, manufacturing personal protective equipment, manufacturing and securing and transporting vaccines, and everything in between, the department played its role flawlessly. So we can look back now and we can assess whether or not the speed in which we implemented the plan was the right speed. I cannot at this point suggest that there are any of the tasks that would be inappropriate for the military. The issue becomes, how do we get the leadership to push forward, drive the military to implementing those tasks and doing that in a coherent and efficient manner? And probably my final point is, are we organized to do this again, as we will? The lessons learned have not been codified, but we will need to address the lessons learned because none of this is new. We've all been talking about it, as I indicated, as early as 2006. We're talking about how we deal with pandemics. So with that as a context, and with that as the roles that the department was identified to play, the last thing I guess I'll say is the department is not the lead for these types of efforts. It's Department of Homeland DHS. And so how we coordinate and liaison with DHS becomes really critically important. And if okay with you, I'll stop there as context and roles and a brief assessment of how we did.
Thank you very much, General, for your overview and covering a wide range of challenges and responses. Now, if I may, as moderator, invite maybe General Gray if he would like to ask a question or make a comment at this point, and then we can go on to other questions, keeping in mind your schedule, General, and then we'll move on to our next speakers. General Gray, would you like to?
Oh, I don't really have any questions, Yonah. Thank you very much, Vince, for a very, very detailed briefing and all. I guess I would say, how would you grade the overall performance of the military during this operation?
I think I'll take a lesson from you. They were slightly above average. I think you called me the last time I think the military did a fantastic job once unleashed. I mean, everything from manufacturing N95 masks, moving vaccines to the localities. The planning effort was something I think we could be very proud of our military. Since I don't give straight A's, I'd give them an A-, because I'm sure in terms of speed of action, and I don't know at this point if the speed of action was delayed by other agencies, but in terms of the tasks that they were assigned, communicating, supporting, creating manufacturing, delivery, securing, all those things, I think they did a fantastic job. I would like to have seen it faster, and hence an A- instead of an A.
Okay, thank you very much, Vince, and it's good to see you again.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much, General Gray. And if I may, as moderator, very quickly ask you a question in terms of preparing to the so-called mega disaster, and whether we are dealing with Mother Nature trigger a threat or man-made. And my question basically is for you to react to the discussion that is going on now, whether we have to fight or combat pandemics, for example, like war situations.
I think if I understand the question, we're going to see other pandemics. This is not the last one that we'll see. We will see this again. We will see mutation of virus as we're seeing now. Because we're flat and people can travel globally, we will see the spread of these pandemics. I just was briefed this morning. You may have seen the image of the C-17 with 60 to 800 Afghans in the body of that airplane, none of them vaccinated. And they're now moving to Qatar and moving to camps in the United States. So yes, we will see pandemics. Yes, there is sufficient evidence to suggest that something is happening with the climate. And so those will lead to other disaster events that we need to be able to support. Whether that you look around the globe at the fires that are breaking out in every corner of the globe, and you must believe that there's something behind that, whether that's man-made or historical cycle. Those will cause us additional challenges for how we support climate changes and how we support future global pandemics. I hope that came close to answering your question.
Yes, thank you very much, General. Are there any members of our panel who would like to ask the General a question or make a comment? Any of our invited audience? Any question, written question? Well, I guess, we can continue for a very long time, General, but we know your schedule is very tight. And
I'm actually going to stick around. I just changed my calendar because I want to hear the rest of the conversation.
oh, that's very kind of you. Okay, great. So if that's the case, we're going to move on to our next speaker. And she was introduced, Professor Rita Caldwell, as we discussed before, and many contributions to our work for many, many years. When I say to our, not only those institutions academically who are trying to develop greater knowledge, wider knowledge in this area, but globally throughout the world, and our contribution as a scientist dealing with the global infectious diseases and water issues and health in general. And that's our latest book. We published also during the years many reports that she contributed to, and we're looking forward for our presentation at this point. Rita?
Thank you very much, Yonah. It's always a pleasure to participate in the programs which you so very ably organize. The role of the military, I think, has been beautifully and very ably presented by General Stewart, who has covered, I think, very much more than I could based on his deep experience. But let me say that I think the critical point is that the role of the Navy is very, and the military in general, is pervasive in the sense that it has the capacity to bring the capabilities of the U.S. Globally, but also in a local way that is critical. Here is an example of Navy ships providing additional hospital beds for urgent care patients. And I think if you follow the news, you know very well that in some states at the present time, the capacity for treating patients of COVID-19 is exhausted, full capacity with no beds available. Hence, the long experience of the military, in this case the Navy, makes it possible to relieve pressure on the local hospital systems and to be able to work closely with shore-based hospitals so they can focus on the COVID-19 cases, because part of the tragedy is that those who need I hate to call it routine, but medical care in general are not able to have access to it because of the overflow of patients that are being treated in the hospitals. The military is without parallel in assisting, providing logistics for equipment and supplies for just not only within the US, but example shown is an airlift to Italy early in the pandemic last year. Being able to transport massive amounts of needed supplies makes a huge difference in combating the pandemic. And I think the very word pandemic means that we can no longer treat the disease as local or as perhaps limited to Africa in the case of Ebola, because now the spread, particularly of COVID-19, which turns out to be transmitted very long distances in a very long period of time through micro droplets. And so airborne transmission is really one of the key factors in understanding this disease. So it's as I would say transmissible as measles, which has long been considered the most transmissible of infectious diseases. And this means that we have to address the combating the disease in a different way than simply being able to treat individuals, but we have to be able to protect against transmission. And again, you can see the ongoing efforts to help vaccinate. Vaccinations are really absolutely key. And to be able to deliver the vaccines and to be able to actually get the vaccines into the arms of as many people as possible in as many countries as possible is clearly critical in combating COVID-19. And even ensuring that the military themselves, each of the combatants and each of the services have the vaccinations distributed is critical, because this means that not only will the individual personnel of the military, but their families. And that means that being able to communicate the value and to be able to communicate the necessity of vaccinations is a rather indirect but highly important component. Let me say that what I think right now that we lack more than anything else is an understanding of the pandemic itself. And that is that understanding that this is a virus that is mutating, mainly because while it has victims, unvaccinated, the virus can replicate and replicate rapidly. During the replication, it rearranges its genomic structure, it mutates, and it selects at the same time for the more virulent form. So it's an ongoing battle if we cannot get vaccinations done. So the understanding of the airborne transmission was key. And that didn't come to us until relatively recently. And one other point I would like to make is that we have to address and understand how to prepare for a pandemic. I've just spent the weekend reading Michael Lewis's book, Premonition. It's not the best book in the world, but it's very interesting and useful because it points out that the principles of distancing, masking, vaccination, done not just individually, but as a combined approach, and also understanding that it's the local public health units working in tandem. And I think the military is a wonderful example of how you can mobilize individual units and be able to succeed in a national effort and a global effort. So with mathematical modeling, I think artificial intelligence and research that's being done and needs to be done so that for the next pandemic, and there certainly is going to be another, there'll be other variations of the COVID-19, but we have to face a future down the road of a COVID 21 or 22 or 25, which will be even more transmissible, even more lethal. And we need to be able to act in an appropriate way to be able to defend against it, because otherwise the mortalities, the loss is going to be huge and truly devastating. Not to say that what we're currently facing isn't devastating and huge, it is, but if you multiply it tenfold or 1,000-fold, you'll get an idea of what may be ahead if we're not prepared. And so I'll close with that. But let me just close by saying that the military is exemplary. It is, I think, a major protection for us as a nation, and very likely globally. We have to focus on what's ahead, and we have to learn. And I think General Stewart has pointed out, we have learned some lessons. We need to coordinate them and be prepared for the next round of what Mother Nature is going to throw at us. One last comment. I don't think it makes much sense at this point to be disputing whether it was man-made or laboratory released or natural. The fact of the matter is, this was a pandemic. This is a pandemic. We are going to have additional pandemics. We should be focusing on the lessons. We should be focusing on the coordination, and we should be focusing on preparing for the next pandemic. Certainly understanding down the road how it all happened will be useful, but right now we have, I think, much more important things to do. So with that, I will close and look forward to the other panelist discussions.
Thank you very much, Rita, for your remarks. I have a quick question now, and perhaps some of our colleagues can jump in. My question to you again, as a distinguished scientist and educator, do you think that governments and the public should consider investing in the next generation, not only of scholars, but scientists, engineers, and people in technology and elsewhere else? Should we, because it takes a very long time, should we also try somehow to focus attention on the role of education in democratic societies?
I feel very strongly about that, because I do think that this unnecessary and tragic polarization that has occurred is, in my view, due to the education system that has failed us for not understanding what is transmissibility, not understanding what a vaccine is and why it's effective, and understanding the limitations. I think this comes from not having the rudimentary scientific, just you don't have to become a scientist, but to have some of the basic principles of fundamental chemistry, biology would be very, very important now and certainly in the future. I would also say, Yonah, that I think what is really more important, at the most important right now, is to rebuild our public health system. We have failed it. We have failed it miserably. It has not been funded properly. The local, regional, and national public health units need to be coordinated. They need to be, they need supplies. They need trained personnel. We really are going to be devastated if we do not rebuild the public health system.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else on the panel? The audience, question this time? If not, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Major General, retired Dr. Mikhail Ionescu. And I'm really delighted that he was able to join us because of his work over the years that we try to follow in terms of the security concerns in Europe and elsewhere, the future of NATO, for example, and the regional stability within the greater Black Sea area, and so forth. So I think going back even to the Cold War concerns at the time, and his contributions are recognized globally. So I recall some of the conferences in Romania, elsewhere, dealing with some of these issues related to health and security concerns. So from your perspectives, General, I think we would like to learn now, especially with developments also around the world that was referred to, the situation in Afghanistan, the issue of refugees and so forth. So we're looking forward to your presentation.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Yonah, for inviting me to take part in this very interesting online meeting with such an important subject, and being attended by outstanding personalities. I am privileged to be alongside you on this panel to discuss such an important issue. And here I would like to inform you that just 2 hours ago, now it's night in Romania, you know, almost night. And on the evening news had been frightening news about the new wave of COVID, Delta. In the last days in Romania, the death had multiplied due to that new wave. As a matter of fact, over the spring and the summer, after the vaccination process had begun, we have become accustomed with the fact that COVID-19 has stopped, but is not that situation now. So we would have to be very careful from that point of view. According to the conversations which I had with Mr. Yonah, I said that I would present the case in Romania answering to this global pandemic. That's why my paper is entitled Armed Forces, Romanian Armed Forces during the COVID-19 contagion, namely the case of Romania. Firstly, you should know that Romania is a small country or a medium-sized country located on the coast, western coast of the Black Sea, having a neighbor, the biggest neighbor of Romania is Ukraine, around 1,000 kilometers long, the frontier between, including also the Republic of Moldova, of course. And the size of Romania is about the size of Utah, of the American state Utah, but with only, it seems to me now, 18 million people, having a military which downsized in the post-Cold War era from 400,000 during the Ceausescu's regime up to under 100,000 military and civilians today. So you would have to keep that in mind as comparatively the proportion of what had happened in Romania, which had been the role of the military in Romania, and so on. My paper is built on 6 or 7 points. Firstly, being called, first point, the so-called strategic shock. As a matter of fact, when the announcement of the International Health WHO announcement in March 11, 2020 of global pandemic had been equivalent not only in Romania, but also in Europe, and it seems to me globally, as a veritable, as a true strategic shock with an impact in many ways identical to the sudden outbreak of a world war in the atomic age. Of course, it was realized immediately, soon I mean, that it is not the case of a strategic shock. It was not a war in a classical understanding of war. So the people in charge and the military also behave accordingly. But at the beginning, and here is the case of Italy, and not only of Italy, but also of Spain or France, they have conceived answering to the new threat in terms of military operation. As a matter of fact, in Italy, for example, they have the general staff of in Italy had conceived the so-called military operation Strada Sicura, Strade Sicura operation Save Roads, namely patrolling the streets in order to maintain the public order. And also in Spain or in France, I remember watching on TV, President Macron saying that we are in the war against an invisible enemy, namely calling it a war. It's sending our thoughts to the fact that we would have to answer militarily to this strategic shock. Also, I would say that the strategic communication of the authorities concerning the evolution of the pandemic has been conceived in military terms. How many had been infected, how many had been interned in the hospitals, how many died, how many had recuperated and things like that. It was like in a war in a way. The second point is the fact that also in Romania, we have prepared it like a kind of military operation. It was not only the military who thought about it, but it was the civilian authorities who organized the answer to that in three points. The first in three periods. The third being a kind of prevention up to the announcement of the pandemic, in which there were taken some measures, like, for example, designating the civilian hospitals, which would be allocated only for the infected by the COVID-19. And the second one had been immediately launched immediately after the announcement, when there were distributed along the 41 districts in Romania the necessary instructions in order to define the epidemiological centers, and not only, also the hospitals, including military hospitals, which would be used only for the infected people. From that point of view, the military had been in the front line of that. Namely, they have given the military hospitals all over the country to be used by the infected people, by the civilian authorities. And at the same time, they have built from the grass, I would say, immediately another 3 hospitals in the main cities of the country, reserved for the third period of the contagion, when the wave of had reached the peak. Or from that point of view, from the very beginning, the military had been considered by the entire nation and also by the civilian authorities like being the main body to tackle with the issue. Finally, due to a kind of irritation of the public opinion about the role of the military and overcoming the equilibrium, the balance between civil and military relations, the Ministry of Internal Affairs took the entire responsibility, the military being behind. But at the same time, I should say that the military had been always, due to their network covering the entire country, and also having military units which are able to tackle with the contagions. We have, as you know, in the structures, units ready to counter radiological or biological threats, and they have been used accordingly. The second point which I would like to make is the new mission. The announcement of the pandemic had given to the military a new mission, and we have witnessed the fact that in terms of security, it was a shift in the missions of the military from defending the country, the borders of the country, and fulfilling also the duty to the allies. The shift had been towards the health of the nation. So it is a kind of shifting in terms of understanding security and enlarging the notion of national security. The health of the nation had been considered like a basic for having security in entirety for that. And from that point of view, I would like that the measures were taken from that. I already had mentioned some of them about building new hospitals and also centers, epidemiological centers, more than 50 in every district, military, and also an institute under the aegis of the armed forces of research. In this, they began to make research for inventing, for producing a vaccine. It was not possible up to now, but at least they have begun to, and they are trying to. The third point is that in spite of the fact that there was a kind of shift in the understanding of security, moving towards the internal mission, at the same time, the military had to answer to their main mission, namely to continue to defend the national interest, and also to fulfill the international national commitments in the fight against terrorism, sending troops in Afghanistan. More than almost 2,000 troops had been sent in 2019, and 1,600 also in Afghanistan in 2020. But not only in Afghanistan, but also in Kosovo, Western Balkans, and also in Mali, in Africa. What is important at this point is the fact that the announcement of the outbreak of the pandemic had caught some Romanian units in international missions, in the full international missions, like had been the case of a naval unit of 2 warships in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea since January up to June. And for that, it was necessary to accommodate to the new environment, because there was a NATO mission in which there were warships from Romania, Bulgaria, Italy, Germany, and other allies in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, but under the command of the Romanian naval staff. So they have continued it, accommodating in the meantime, in order not to interrupt this mission. So at the same time, they have attended the Romanian military have attended some of the exercises who replaced the Defend 20, the main US exercise in Europe, which had been canceled at the beginning of the pandemic, but being replaced by small other exercise around, and the Romanian military attended also such kind of exercises. And in 2021, namely this year, the Defend Europe 21 had been in the last 25 years the main, the main exercise promoted, organized, and fulfilled by the U.S. armed forces together with the Allies in such a way, proving the commitment of USA for defending Europe. And also, some of the parts of this exercise had been in our region and also on our territory, and the Romanian armed forces had attended it. Another point it's that Romania had coordinated the answer to the threat of COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021 with NATO and European Union. It's important to consider from that point of view that there was a difference between two organizations. As I have said, Defend 2020 had been canceled, and also the American troops deployed in Europe had been retreated in March and April. And also NATO had canceled some of the exercises, and this was there were warning signs of what means defending Europe, what means U.S. commitment to defend Europe, and things like that. Concerning EU, should be said that from the very beginning, after some hesitations at the beginning, European Union had organized in April 2020 an online meeting of all the defense ministers of the member states, in which they have discussed what they have done up to now in each country and what should be done in the future in order to counter the threat. And for that had been created with that occasion also a kind of staff at the level of European Union in charge of following and collecting all the data from that point of view in order to be shared with all the allies, the best experience, in order to be applied in each country. And at the same time, collecting the data in order to base all the new defense initiative or the European Union level on this data. So from that point of view, I can say that even if the answer to this pandemic had not been a global answer, at least at the European Union level, there was a cooperation between the member states within the European Union. And I would say that also after several months from the outbreak of the pandemic, also in the case of NATO, had been also a coordination and cooperation. I would mention here that even in April, NATO headquarters had launched in Europe, had launched a research project in order to find out the best device to diagnose the pandemic. And the member states, the specialist experts from the member states contributed to it. Another point is about combating misinformation, close to Russia, close to aggressiveness of Moscow, and at the same time having the Black Sea like a hotspot and the Eastern Mediterranean in the neighborhood like a hotspot from geopolitical and geostrategic view, had created to the Romanian military the perception that in spite of the pandemic and in spite of the differences between what had been security before and after, the geopolitics didn't die, and they are continuing in other forms. And from that point of view, for example, disinformation like part of the hybrid war waged by Russia, but not only by Russia, by China, by Turkey, and the others, were considered like threats in order to be tackled with. And from that point, I would give you two examples only. For example, the first had been that in March 2020, already European Union sent a warning to the member states that the Russians are using the pandemic in order to grow the Euroscepticism, spreading out news and theories, false theories about the origin of the pandemic, the way in which it's, and so on and so forth. And the second one is the recent one, after the huge concentration of forces, Russian forces in March at the frontier of Ukraine, immediately after, at the highest level, at the level of Putin, had been launched a theory which is spreading out all over, and it's becoming obligatory in all the education system of Russia, namely that between the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, namely these all three nations, are only one nation by history and by future. So in a way, they are forbidding, I would say, the identity of other nations, and in a way attacking their independence and sovereignty. Finally, and sorry for being too long, is the fact that European Union had covered the entire population of the member states with the vaccines. They took, after some hesitation at the beginning, but not only. They have launched a program for economic recovery and rebuilding economy on according to the digital era and to the climate change era, in order to rebuild the economy, to tackle, to face, and to respond to the requirements of the future. And from that point of view, not only that they had conceived that kind of plan, but they had provided the European Union, all the member states, provided the funds for such kind of plan for each nation, not only loans, namely to give back money which you are receiving, but also important sums being like grants. And this is according to project which should be fulfilled up to 2026, namely in 5 years from now. For example, Romania had to spend on this kind of projects more than 30 billion euro. This is the point which I have I had to present in front of you as a case of Romania as a medium-sized country in a very sensitive geopolitical region close to the Black Sea had to answer to the threat of the pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very comprehensive in terms of the COVID-19 and the role of the military. Now, I would like to ask you related again to the health concerns in terms of the tradition in Romania for many years to train foreign students in medical schools. So my question to you is, one of the challenges that we know that you don't have sufficient number of medical personnel to serve in the hospitals and to deal with the pandemics as well as general health concerns. Is Romania also focusing now in terms of training some medical students, particularly from poor countries, and perhaps even countries related to that issue in the Middle East and elsewhere?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. As you know, because you know that Romania, traditionally had educated a lot of students in medical training from the Middle East countries in the communist era, and even in the first decade of the post-Cold War era. I would mention that also today in the faculties of Romania, there are, it seems to me, 8 or 10 very good faculties all over the countries, with several 2,000 or 3,000 of graduates each year. There are also many foreigners. But we have to tackle with a new phenomenon. As I have said at the beginning, the population of Romania is now about 18 millions. In fact, the Romanians are and were 23 or 24 millions, but 5 or 6 millions already emigrated in Europe, especially. Is more than 1 million in the last 15 years who settled in Italy, 1.2 million in Spain, 1 million in UK, 1 million in Germany. I don't know how many in France and in other countries. As a matter of fact, and we don't have the figure, the exact figure, we have almost 6 million Romanians who emigrated. And among them, this is the most important thing, among them, there are the main parts of the most active population, and also graduates of the superior educations. And among them, doctors, medics. As a matter of fact, a lot of doctors, due to the differences between the salaries, the wages in Romania and in the West, in spite of the fact that prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19, the government took the decision to raise dramatically the wages of the doctors. In spite of that, they are continuing to emigrate abroad. In a way, we had covered the necessities of the COVID-19s, especially in the urban areas. The fact that, for example, in the rural areas, and more than 40% of the Romanian populations are living in the rural area, due to that fact that the success of the vaccine campaign is in the urban area, it's okay, but in the rural area, is low. This is a problem which we would have to be taken into account in order to prepare ourselves better for the future. I don't know if I have answered to your questions, but that's the situation in this field, which is a situation which is a concern of the entire Romanian nation now.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the panelists or the audience?
We do have a question from the audience from Professor Santa Maria. She asks, General, under your opinion, does Romania invest more resources in nuclear and radiological issues than in biological issues in terms of threats or safety and security? Thank you very much.
Well, as a matter of fact, we have 2 battalions in our armed forces, which, how to say, are had been involved, and 2 battalions of civil CIMIC, civil and military cooperation, which had been involved almost immediately in their zone of deployment in the country, and they have been deployed in order to disinfection of the areas. And among the conclusions of my paper is that, it's a general conclusion, is that the military would have to organize more such kind of units at the level of battalions, which in the case of a new pandemic would be very useful to be used. And not only the Romanian military should have taken into account that kind of new structures. It seems to me that also other militaries, because they are well prepared, they have the confidence of the population, they know from the very beginning what to do, etc. And that's why, as a matter of fact, for example, in 3 cases in big cities in Romania, the civilians management of the hospitals, of the big hospitals, had failed, and it was necessary to deploy military commander in order to make them manageable. That's my answer to your question. It's very hard for me to say if we are applying more effort in terms of, as a matter of fact, the battalion for radiological and biological threats are acting together. They are a full formation. It's called CBRT. It's the name of this kind of structures. Multiplying that kind of battalions, small structures, are very useful in these cases.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we better move on to Ambassador Retired Charlie Ray. Again, he does not need introduction because he participated all these years in our work and study on the role of diplomacy in world affairs. As many of you know, he had decades of foreign service in the United States State Department, serving in Africa and Asia. In addition to that, in the Pentagon, he focused on issues related to POW, missing personnel, and so on and so forth. So again, Charlie, looking at the situation now in terms of the COVID, which is again, I think becoming more critical in the face of the humanitarian crisis that is going on. So from your experience, again, the military, how do you see the approaches that are needed at this time in terms of distribution, for example, of vaccines, rescue missions, and so on?
Well, thank you, Yonah, and first of all, thank you for including me. I'd like to echo what everyone has already said. I think the military performance here in the U.S. and abroad has been first rate, given the conditions they've had to work under. Military support to civil authority is a time-honored tradition in this country. We provided military support in natural disasters throughout my 20 years in the military, from the 60s to the 80s. And I think we can learn some lessons in this pandemic from the military. I mean, if you look at the statistics, for example, the infection rates per 100,000 among military personnel slightly lower than the general population. And when you consider the military environment and the nature of military operations, that's actually really quite remarkable. And of course, you know, the military tends to be younger and healthier, so the death rate per 100,000 was significantly lower than among the civilian population. But I think the lessons to be learned from that, though, is that the military, despite a slightly slow start, took very decisive action to minimize or mitigate the impact of this virus. Being retired military, I spent a lot of time on military bases over the last 18 months. And things such as masking, social distancing, and quarantines were a lot more uniformly applied in the military than in civilian communities, and with much better effect. So that's a lesson to be learned. The other thing, though, and this might sound as I might be sounding as if I'm backing away from what others have said, but I'd like to expand on something that Dr. Colwell said about the need to invigorate our public health system. We should never forget that the military's role in supporting civilian authority is supposed to be when the civilian authority is overwhelmed and they need the military to fill in the gaps. Well, if you don't have a civilian capability, it means that you're turning entirely to the military to do it. And the problem with that is the military's primary role is to defend the nation against all manner of adversaries. And I think we were lucky during this pandemic that none of our adversaries decided to take advantage of it and start some conflict somewhere that our military, because it was tied up with helping out in the pandemic, would not have had the resources to deal with. I think we have to keep in mind, though, that all of our adversaries are probably doing their own lessons learned from this, and we might not be so lucky the next time. And I would just close with a comment that was made to me many years ago after the unit that I was stationed with at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, deployed for its third disaster assistance mission during the time that I was there. And one of the colonels that I worked with said that every day spent doing these missions, as worthwhile as they are, is a day lost in developing the capability to perform your main mission, which is to meet and defeat the enemies of the country. And the longer you do it, the farther in arrears you get in being able to do your primary mission. So I would just say I strongly agree with Dr. Colwell. We need to build the civilian capacity to deal with these pandemics so that the military, in fact, is truly doing what it was designed to do, and that's filling in when the civilian capacity has been overburdened, not filling in because the civilian capacity is not there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much again. Are there any comments from members of the panel or the audience?
All I can say is I agree so fully with you, General Ray. This is if we don't do this, the next pandemic is really going to decimate the country.
Charlie, let me ask you again. Your many years in the military and diplomatic work, what do you think, especially now, in light of the experience that we had a year and a half or so, in terms of the role of diplomacy, in terms of increasing international cooperation to combat pandemics? And secondly, in terms of restoring public trust in the capability of governments to meet their responsibilities of leadership and support organizational structure in terms of the medical responses, in terms of the economic approaches, and so on and so forth. So what do you think should the priority be at this time on the part of government as well as the international community?
Well, I think, first I'd like to say we've got to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to get this in one piece, or in as whole a piece as we can. But at the same time, we need to be looking at what to do to prepare to forestall the next one. It's great. I think, and thank goodness for the military, our response to the pandemic, once it had taken hold, was I'll give it a B plus instead of an A minus, because I don't look at it as just the military response, but the whole of government response. I think a lot more could have been done and must be done in developing international contacts and relationships. One, so that we can start mapping the potential origins of these pandemics. Places like China, like the Congo River Basin, the rainforest, where people are coming into increasing contact with wildlife habitats, and we're running into these animal to human transmission of diseases. The nightmare scenario is that the next pandemic will be as contagious as COVID, but as deadly as Ebola. And if we wait until it takes hold before we start responding to it, we're going to see a lot more than 600,000 people in the US dead, a lot more than 4 million worldwide. So we need to start looking at ways to forecast, to stop it at the source, or at least to minimize it at the source. And we do that through international contacts, international relationships, through diplomacy. We need to have more cooperation in science and technology. We had at one point, I believe, people from the Centers for Disease Control working in China, but prior to the pandemic, we had reduced that capacity to near zero. Instead of reducing our international footprint in these areas, we need to increase it. We need to have people where these diseases might originate so that they can work with locals to try and minimize it or stop it there, rather than trying to fight it off after it's already jumped the ocean.
Okay.
Ambassador, I made you an honorary general. I really am intrigued by the fact that we do have an international problem. There's no way around it, because you can't stop the disease just at the borders of our country, or the borders of Romania, or Russia or whatever. This, particularly an airborne transmitted infectious agent, and I do think this. I haven't proved it. Others, I'm working on it, but others are beginning to think about it. I do think that there is potential for intercontinental transmission aside from just inside people in airplanes. And so I think, how do you see coming together to be able to combat this through the diplomatic route? How do you see this happening?
Well, I think having agreements with countries, for just as an example, I was reading about a Congolese research lab that's studying these viral diseases in the Congo Basin. I am sure we probably have contact with them, but we should have agreements and people on the ground so that we can share technology, share information, and work with each other to try and identify these potential diseases before human transmission becomes widespread. We spend billions on things that blow up. We should start spending a few million on things that keep things together. I mean, it's just a Marine general friend of mine when I worked at the Pentagon once said, if we can afford to spend the money we do to make war, we should be able to afford to spend the money to prevent it. And so there is more. We need to have the political will to invest in the non-kinetic people-to-people type relationships that share information, that share technology, that look for these problems before they're slapping us in the face.
Yeah.
If I could just build on that, I'll try anyway. Over the last 2 decades or so, we talk about the elements of national power, but we default to the military elements of national power.
Yes.
We very rarely talk about the diplomatic and the informational. And when we get those things bundled right, we get a chance to deal with almost any crisis globally.
Yes.
But the policy has almost always been, how do I use military force to get this done? And I think that's a losing proposition in the long term.
Yeah.
I think we've been very fortunate to have a very honorable military and military leaders in this past few years.
The problem is, as General Stewart said, is that there's this tendency to look for the quick fix. And when you need something done quickly and effectively, no one's better at it than the military. It does not mean that is the preferable or right way to get it done, because you're not building the capacity and you're detracting from the military's capability to do its main mission. Military people are not diplomats. They are not doctors. They're military people. I mean, their job is, in the first instance, to prevent war, but they do that by honing their skills to wage war. And when they are having to run hospitals, run morgues, deliver vaccines to rural communities, they're not honing their capability to do their main mission. And all it takes is one opportunistic adversary to catch us in a situation like that, and then we really have a mess. And so, you know, I think General Stewart said, well, we tend to always look for the military. Well, you know, the old saying is, when your tool of choice is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. We need to start looking at the whole toolbox and make sure that all of our tools are equipped to do the job.
May I say something? It's necessary to take into account that the answer to the next pandemic should be a global one. If the pandemic would begin in a certain point, if we wouldn't be able to isolate it and so on and so forth, and it's becoming global, the answer should be global. And for that, we would have to have a leader. May I say, sorry for saying that, but in my country, and not only in my country, in Europe had been an expectation that US would take the lead in order to defeat the COVID-19 crisis. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that Borrell, you know, the Spaniard who is representative of European Union for security and foreign policy, said that since the beginning of the 20th century up to now, always USA took the lead of our continent, First World War, Second World War, Cold War, in order to defeat the threat, to tackle the threat. In the pandemic, didn't show up such kind of leadership. Sorry saying that. Next time we would have to think about it, and diplomacy from the point of view had a very great share of the burden, I would say, in order to create such an environment conducive to such a leadership.
While I support the idea of U.S. leadership, who steps up when the United States doesn't? Because that's from my perch. Yes, I would like to have seen greater leadership, but I also didn't see anyone in Europe step up and say, okay, we got this. We can't count on the Americans, so over to
I
us.
agree. They were waiting for you.
That's probably not always a good
like in the
course of
First
action.
World, like in the Second World War, like during the Cold War, you know. I know your point of view, I know. That's why Europe is a signal for Europe in order to the so-called burden sharing. It's very, very important. Now they are looking seriously to it.
Well, you know, I think, General Stewart, you know, sort of to address what you said of who steps up. I think one of the things, in my personal view, that might have contributed to that was this sort of me first, to heck with you attitude that we were conveying to the world. And people follow that lead. I mean, I put myself in the place of, say, Germany or France. If the U.S., the country that has been the leader of the free world for decades, is saying, forget about you, I'm looking out for me. Well, what can you expect other countries to do? They're going to follow that example and look out for themselves. And so if we want to back to basic military, I mean, in order to ensure that every person in your unit is capable of leading, you have to model leadership so that they feel confident to step forward. If the leader is seen as only caring about himself, I mean, you don't look old enough to have been too much in Vietnam, General Stewart, but I was there. That's where the term fragging came from, is leaders who cared more about themselves than they cared about their troops. And countries are no different. If the country that is seen as the leader is not leading, the example is not being set for others to step up and put themselves on the hot seat.
Someday I'll tell you a story that fits into that over Diet Coke, where we asked a partner to do something. He said, not in our interest, because you all have said we're going to go it alone.
Right.
Let me pose a challenge to this very point. Right now, the evidence is beginning to be gathered, showing that the immunity from the two good vaccines, well, there are several vaccines, but let's say the newest, the devised ones, the Moderna and the Pfizer, the immunity may last. At first, it was said 8 months, but there's been a report, I think, coming out of Israel where it may only be 6 months. Now, the question is, to defeat this pandemic, we can't just vaccinate in the US and Europe. We have got to vaccinate in India, parts of Asia and Latin America, or we're not going to be out of this, because it will be Lambda variant, and then you can go through the whole Greek alphabet with variants, some of which will be duds, but some of which will be highly transmissible and dangerous. So how do we get a global agreement and cooperation to work at getting vaccine to everybody?
Well, I think that's where, that's where we need to dispatch battalions of diplomats backed up by scientists who can talk the talk and reach out to the countries that have the capability of manufacturing the vaccines and start forging agreements to build up stockpiles. Because I agree with you, if we don't vaccinate people in remote villages in South America and Africa and Asia, we're just waiting for the next version of this pandemic to come and really wreak havoc. So you get it done by doing it. I mean, we need to start working on doing just that.
You may recall in the National Implementation Plan that identified the 13 different tasks. Number one, advance international cooperation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Secure international commitment to transparency, scientific cooperation, rapid reporting of human and animal cases, and sharing of data. That's the number one. If I were advising the Chinese as a strategic global plan, I would tell them to, first of all, put together the Marshall Plan for dealing with this pandemic, turn all your economic engines against the defeat, and be the presence and the leadership going forward, because we can't count on Western nations. And that would be my strategic plan if I were advising the Chinese. It's also the strategic plan if I were advising any administration in the West also.
That's good advice for the whole world. We need to put aside, I long for the old days when foreign policy stopped at the water's edge. And we fought domestically, but when it came to issues of international importance, we put our political differences aside and did what was necessary. We need to have leadership that's willing to knock a few heads together internationally to go back to that. And if it means offending people, I volunteer to be the first one to start hurling offense, because we can't afford. I don't think we could afford a repeat of COVID-19.
Yeah, you are right.
So do we have a consensus here that we can address globally the pandemics as one of the most critical threats to humanity? In other words, how do we deal, number one, with the perception of the threat, and secondly, in the era of scarce resources, can we really develop, generals, a Manhattan-like approach to focus on particularly the bio threats at this time, and obviously to also look at some other WMD threats and cyber threats? How do we do that in terms of organizational structure and personnel and funding? And who is going to call the shots? Can the United States somehow, in view of what's happening in Afghanistan and elsewhere, regain their leadership role?
I think we, I'm sorry, go ahead, General.
No, I defer to the Vietnam.
Well, I think we can. The question is whether we will. And I would say that we have to start with changing the attitudes at the top. Getting the organizations, getting the relationships done is a matter of empowering the people on the ground to do it. But in order to do that, they need the people at the top who develop the policy and who pass the budgets to have the political will to do that. And so until we get a commitment at the top that we will try to actually build a better world, then we're going to be fighting these brush fires until we run out of water.
Let me tell you my worst case scenario. Having the world watch the impact of this pandemic in the United States and around the globe. If I were a terrorist organization and I wanted to build a martyrdom operation, because if you're going to blow yourself up, you know you're going to die. I would infect a number of folks with the disease, and I would send them to New York and London and Paris and have them go through customs, spread it, because we're going to forget about this in another year. It's going to be, oh yeah, remember that thing that happened a couple of years ago? So I would be very patient, and I would do a martyrdom operations with individuals who are infected. I'd send them to all the major cities, and I will see at that point whether we've learned our lesson that international coordination is important, that getting the word out accurately is important, the judicious use of the military where they can, et cetera, et cetera. But I would, if I were running global terrorist martyrdom operations, that could be really interesting.
General, you can join the club, but you're not a charter member, because that plan has been described in the Potomac Institute Studies on Bioterrorism about a decade or two ago. You're absolutely right. That this pandemic has been the example, primary example of how you do bioterrorism. And it's a whole lot more scary in some ways than a nuclear threat.
In general, what you have said, like a worst scenario, has been used by the Mongols in the 13th century.
Yes, that's right.
Who sent the bodies of infected people with plague within the walls of the besieged cities, you know, to infect the other.
There's also more recent evidence just in our country with smallpox in the Native Americans.
That's
right. Infected them with smallpox. In fact,
yeah.
So sorry it wasn't an original thought, but there you go.
But it's an important one. It's clearly important.
And I think we have to keep in mind, it doesn't have to be a terrorist organization to do it. A hostile nation, I won't name the nations that would have the will to actually mount an operation like that, which would be, that's my worst nightmare, is not a terrorist operation, but a hostile nation that decides to do that very thing.
Well, we happen to know there was an incident of a factory in a certain country where it killed a number of its own people because of the escape of anthrax.
Could be like the gas in the First World War, when the wind brought back the gas to their own trenches, you know, and killed their own people, and they said, no, it's enough. So we would have to have an understanding, not to use gas.
I, as a moderator, I look at the clock and it's still ticking. So I think we certainly will continue the discussion and dialogue in the coming weeks and months. Now I would like to invite General Al Gray to make some closing remarks.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Yonah. And I want to thank all the panelists for a very, very, actually a superb discussion on a real major challenge, not to our country alone, not only to our country alone, but to the world as we know it today. It's very clear from the discussion that we have to put someone in charge here in the United States, and to set the example for, but there is somebody that has to be in charge of this pandemic and crisis response in America, and hopefully in the other nations around the world will take the cue and put somebody in charge as well. It's very important for this organization, whether it's State Department, whether it's a new organization, whatever the case may be, they must understand that we don't have a corner on the market on all the answers and all the ideas. There are many good ideas around the world, and somehow, some way, we got to get at them and listen to them. It's very clear when we heard the discussion from Romania today. There's a hell of a lot of good ideas out there in these different countries and regions of the world. Secondly, this organization has to really understand the national elements of power. It's not just the military or economic or societal or technology. It's all the elements of national power that are created here in this great country as well as in other countries around the world. We're going to have to learn to deal with adversaries, with people that we don't deal with, like China and Russia and others, and stop talking so much about peer-to-peer relationships and all that kind of thing, and start talking about what the heck is good for the nation and the world. And again, we don't have a corner on the market of the ideas. There are good ideas all around the world. So we have to put somebody in charge. They have to have an organization. It has to be funded properly by the Congress of the United States. It has to be international in scope, no question about that. And we have experience there. We've had experience with NATO and with other international organizations, and we've got to figure out a way to have an international organization which includes countries that may be considered adversarial at this point in time. But again, it's all the elements of national power. The military may be a model, but that's only a model. It's all the elements that have to be taken under consideration. They should play, after study and all, they should play international war games on this topic. That's one good way of playing the what-if game and seeing just how prepared you really, really are and what steps you have to take to get further prepared, etc. I could go on all day and all night about this topic, but the point is that you don't need any more. You need a good, responsible organization. You need good, responsible leadership, and it has to be in a crisis management mode. And hopefully, it will be international in scope. And again, I want to thank all the panelists. Very, very interesting. And we should. This is something the Potomac Institute has long believed in, nonpartisanship advice to our nation and to the international community. And we should consider, Yonah, when we develop our report and the comments from everybody, we should consider coming up with a plan that this country and other countries may find usable. It certainly won't hurt, and it certainly will serve to point up all the different issues. There are many, many, many issues, and they may seem insurmountable, but they're not. They're solvable. If we solved different challenges before. We've solved nuclear challenges to some extent. We've solved other challenges, and we have to do the best we can here for the good of all mankind.
Thank you very much, Jen. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Jen?
I'm here.
Yeah. Okay, would you like to make a comment at this point?
It's really hard to follow up from General Gray's language there. No, but so, Yonah, I want to thank you for coordinating another event on such a timely topic. As we watch world events transpire and thinking about the potential of the next pandemic. And hearing so many of your comments today really made me reflect on how our civil healthcare system is struggling, and how many lessons they have to learn from the military. They've been in crisis mode now for 16 going on 17 months, and they can't sustain that, just like our military. We don't expect them to stay in action for that long.
I'll go ahead and submit the paperwork to bring Mahal and Charlie and General Stewart back on active duty. I'll bring Rita back on active duty as an advisor, and we'll get this thing moving, Yonah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I guess we have to end on time. Thank you very much.
It's been a great discussion.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.